So, welcome everyone to today's seminar on girls' rights in war and conflict. I'm Jens Petersson, Secretary General of the United Nations Association of Sweden, and it's a privilege to have you here as we approach the International Day of the Girl Child, celebrated on October 11th. Our organization, with chapters across Sweden, works tirelessly to strengthen the UN's core pillars, peace, development and human rights, with one of our focus areas being the rights of girls. For over a decade, we've partnered with UNFPA to promote sexual and reproductive health and rights for girls worldwide. In times of war and conflict, the girls are among the most vulnerable. They face heightened risk of child marriage, sexual violence, and the denial of access to health care and education. In conflict zones, the rate of child marriages is double to the global average, and as casualties rise, so do these marriages. Recent events highlight just how dire the situation has become. In August, escalated attacks on Kyiv left hospitals struggling to protect pregnant women and newborns amongst the constant bombings. One expectant mother, Julia, voiced her fears. "It's not just about me, it's about my unborn child." Education has also been shattered, with over 2,000 children killed or injured and more than 1,300 schools destroyed in Ukraine alone. The situation in Gaza is equally heartbreaking. Since the terror deeds on last year's October 7th, more than 14,500 children have been killed and many more are missing. Nearly 90% of Gaza's schools have been damaged or destroyed, forcing children into adult roles like street vending and fetching water, realities that strip away their futures as well as their childhood. This past week's intensified attacks in Lebanon have forced over 90,000 people, including 25,000 women and girls, to flee their homes, while nearly 600 lives have been lost. The scale of this displacement, over 90,000 people in just 1 week, is staggering. And when I started working at UNA Sweden in the earlier years of this century, another conflict, the genocide in Darfur, was a burning topic. And today, sadly, that situation is now on repeat. Girls in conflict zones can't wait. Their rights, futures, and lives are at stake. Today's seminar is a crucial opportunity to discuss these urgent challenges and explore how we, through international law, through the UN, with the help of civil society, can protect and uphold girls' rights. Now more than ever, we need immediate action and unwavering commitment. Thank you. And now I would like to give the floor, hand things over to Malin Swartling, UNA Sweden's advisor on girls' rights, who will be moderating the remainder of this seminar. Thanks.
I'm just going to double check. Is it working? Oh, perfect. So thank you, Jens, for the introduction, and a warm welcome to everyone for being here. A welcome to the audience, a welcome to the panelists and the speakers. As Jens mentioned, we are here today to focus on a critical issue of girls' rights in war and conflict settings. With the International Day of Girl Child approaching, we thought it was going to be a great opportunity to shed light on the challenges faced by young girls everywhere right now in conflict zones and the urgent need to global action. So to start off, we're honored today to have the first speaker, Carolina Schulte-Holstein, with us today, the Deputy Director of UN Affairs and Agenda 2030 at the Swedish Ministry of Health and Social Affairs. So a big round of applause for Carolina. This should work now.
Does it work? Yes. Perfect. So thanks a lot for having me. Thanks, Malin, for the kind invitation. I'm really glad to be here and see so many of you here. As Malin said, I'm working as Deputy Director for UN Affairs and Agenda 2030 at the Ministry for Health and Social Affairs here in Stockholm. And right now I'm working specifically on a global conference to end violence against children, which is why I was invited to speak here today. And this conference is the first of its kind. And our Minister for Social Services, Camilla Waltersson Grönvall, took on the task of being a co-host to this conference during last year, together with Colombia, who is the main host, and also WHO, UNICEF, and UN Special Representative on Violence Against Children. And we're working very hard now in this core group to plan this conference. We've been working together for almost 9 months. And I wanted to highlight a few points to you about this conference. But first, let me also say that today the theme is girls' rights and girls in conflict everywhere. And of course, this conference will be a conference on ending all violence against children. And of course, specific focus will be aimed at violence against girls in different contexts, and especially violence against adolescent girls. But I will come back to this a bit more later on. Just to give a brief introduction, this conference, as I said, is really one of its kind. We held a conference in Stockholm in 2018 called End Violence Solutions Summit, which also had a high level of representation from civil society and from governments. But in this conference, we have invited 193 countries. And right now we have an amazing response from many governments and also a lot of civil society organizations, which is, of course, fantastic. The purpose of this conference is really very straightforward. Violence against children is a global issue and a global concern, which is why we have to require global solutions. And each year, half of the world's children are victim to violence, which impacts their lives and also impacts generations to come. And there is really no path to deliver the sustainable development goals without faster reduction of the violence 1 billion children experience right now. And especially target 16.2 will be of focus at this conference, since in the Agenda 2030 we have committed, the governments have all committed to end violence against children by 2030. And frankly, in our view, progress has been too slow, and we really hope that this conference would help accelerate the work. I want to raise 3 points about the conference, which are more practical. Firstly, as I said, we've been working quite a lot in this core group, and we've been working mainly with forming the program and outlining what do we want to emphasize at this conference. So the program, you can find it on the webpage for the conference. We can probably circulate it later. And it will circulate around high-level panels constructed with both ministers, but also adolescents, children, and civil society actors to come together at these high-level panels to discuss different issues and topics related to violence against children. And there will also be a lot of special technical sessions during specifically day 2 at this conference, where we will have time to also sit down and discuss with government representatives, civil society actors, and children and adolescents to move forward on a more technical level. So there will be political elements and more technical elements in the conference. Furthermore, I also wanted to inform you about that there will be different side events at this conference. Of course, we will have several formal side events, but also many satellite events organized by several different organizations. Especially, I wanted to highlight Girls Not Brides, because I know you're present here today, and I know you also are engaged in satellites events for this conference, if I'm not mistaken, which is very good. And many of these side events will also focus on gender dimensions of violence against children, but also child recruitment connected to children in conflict and children in armed conflict and so on. But all of this you can find also on the webpage, so I won't take up more time to explain about different details. And my third point is that I wanted to inform you that, of course, there's something happening after the conference. So currently we're working hard in the core group to prepare a call to action document, which we hope that as many representatives at the conference as possible will stand behind when we leave the conference in Bogota on the 8th of November. So this is a work ongoing, and as I said, Sweden will be represented in Bogota by our Minister for Social Services, Camilla Waltersson Grönvall, and also our Children's Ombudsman, Juno Blom, together with a small delegation also from the government offices. And I just wanted to pinpoint a few things that are important to Sweden and my minister at this conference. Of course, we will be engaged in a lot of discussions, but we come to this conference with an experience of prohibiting corporal punishment. We prohibited corporal punishment in 1979, which is of course something that we would like to highlight and also emphasize the importance of prohibiting corporal punishment and legislate to prohibit corporal punishment. And furthermore, we also wanted to put specific highlight on violence against children online, in the online world, because children today, they are spending more time in the online environment. There's sexual abuse, cyberbullying, to name just a few areas which are very troublesome for children in the online world. And the online world doesn't know borders as other issues, which is why this is a point very important to my minister to raise at this conference and to have as a red thread throughout the conference and discuss this thoroughly in the global context. And finally, I also wish to encourage you to look at the conference webpage. You can find the program, all the side events, and all the satellite events. And the conference address is endviolenceagainstchildrenconference.org, but we can, of course, share this later on. And my minister is, of course, very proud to be part of this conference and to accelerate these important topics forward. And we used to say now when we speak about the conference that ending violence against all children is not the right thing, only the right thing to do, is also the smart thing to do. So this has become a bit of a slogan which we say a lot when we talk about this conference. I wanted to end just by emphasizing that in the context of this seminar, as I mentioned previously, there are a few sessions focusing specifically on violence against adolescent girls, violence in crisis, and also these side events on child recruitment, which I think is very important for the audience here. But please look at the webpage. There will be more satellite events and side events, which I think will be very interesting to all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carolina, for that very insightful talk. And I just have a question. You mentioned that this is the first ministerial conference on this topic. And I'm just wondering, why did Sweden choose to co-host the conference in Bogota, and what is the significance of Sweden's involvement in addressing the issues of violence against children? How does this align with Sweden's broader commitment to child protection?
Thank you so much for the question, and I think it's a very good one. As I mentioned a little bit in my speech, Sweden has been working with those issues for a long time. We have prohibited corporal punishment 1979. In the global context, which is sometimes a bit different than also the national context, we have to remember that Sweden is really in the forefront when it comes to these issues. In the global context, a lot of countries are looking to Sweden to see what have we been doing, how did we end up where we are right now, how did we work historically. So that is the main point, I would say, to why we wanted to engage in this conference, to show that we are still committed to these issues. And even though it was a long time since we adopted our legislation, we are still committed to this work, and violence against children and children's rights in general are issues that are very important both on the international level but also on the domestic level. So my minister is working very hard on different national reforms. So we wanted to take that context also, what we're working with nationally, and bring it to the global level. And also to exchange knowledge, share what we are doing, but also to collect information. What are other countries doing, for example, related to the obstacles and challenges that we are facing today in Sweden, for example, connected to gang violence and so on. Yeah. So this is really, in short, why we wanted to be part of this conference.
Thank you so much. A big round of applause.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So before we begin the panel discussion for today, we first want to turn our attention to the legal framework surrounding war and girls' rights. To guide us through this very important topic, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Sally Longworth, who is a researcher in international law at the Swedish Defense Research Agency. So a big warm round of applause to Sally Longworth.
Okay, so what did you do then? That way. First, right, great. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me here today. I was given the challenge, I would say, to talk for 10 minutes about girls' rights in armed conflict, which is not possible. My slides are not comprehensive in this, I would say, because, but as a summary, we can say the same rights apply as are applicable in peacetime. And then there are extra protections that we get from international humanitarian law, which I'll talk a little bit about as well. The main message I think though with this is that, and as has already been hinted at somewhat already in the presentations, is that during armed conflict, violations of rights and rights issues generally tend to be exacerbated. In armed conflict. The conflict situation doesn't tend to fix situations. So the protections under international human rights law are critical as adding a further layer of protection to these rights. We can also see as well how violations of international human rights, humanitarian law, and problems within created by the situation of armed conflict then affects the protection of other human rights. So when we're talking about the lack of reduced services or lack of access to services, healthcare, education, employment, these have very significant gendered effects. And we are growing in our understanding and knowledge about this experiences of different peoples within armed conflict, men, women, girls, boys, and the differences as well, very importantly, when we're talking about children, and as has already been mentioned, of younger children versus older children. But we are still missing significantly some areas and information of the experiences of children. For example, trans rights is an area that has grown in our understanding in human rights law. The experiences of trans people within armed conflict is something that we're starting to become aware of. But there has been very little research. And then particularly when you then add on the layer of children's rights as well, trans children, then you can see where there are still gaps in our understanding. And I think as well, understanding this connection between the human rights protections and IHL is very important. We can see this in the examples that we already see. So we're talking about the girls being forcibly married. The experiences we've seen, for example, in Syria, in the armed conflicts that are ongoing there, versus in Ukraine. Girls have very different experiences in these situations because of the rights violations or the problems with protection of rights in those countries prior to the conflict, and then how that is then exasperated in the conflict. International criminal law is very important as well in understanding this, because the international criminal law is the kind of the secondary norms as we talk about. The primary norms, the first norms you look to that establish the rights in IHL and international human rights law, and then serious violations can then go over to the level of international criminal law. This is an area that has also seen a significant development in understanding of crimes against children and women and crimes that affect children and women. We've had significant progress within the International Criminal Court statute that recognises significantly the codification of gender-based crimes, particularly when it comes to sexual and gender-based violence, the crimes against humanity of persecution. I also think that it's important. International criminal law is also interesting because it demonstrates the very extreme form, the different experiences in armed conflict. And we see that both in the substance of the law, the crimes that are themselves established. So when you look at the crime of genocide, there are 2 specific subparagraphs relating to preventing births within the group or forcibly transferring children. That have very, very specific impacts on children and women, particularly. So it highlights these very extreme forms, both in substance, but then as well we've seen in the case law that follows famously from the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the differentiated experience of women and children in the conflict. So this is a very long list, but it's not the longest list that it could be. I've only included here what we call universal treaties, so that all states can sign on to. And I haven't included them all. So when we look at the experience of women and girls in armed conflict and the breaches of their rights, very important to take this with an intersectional perspective. For example, the women that have been subjected to genocide and crimes against humanity in Myanmar, the Rohingya community, they are targeted in very particular ways because they are women. But that is also a form of racial discrimination. So the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination is also relevant and needs to be read in that context as well. So we have the universal rights conventions at the top. There has been a huge amount of work and research into the breaches of civil and political rights, so torture, detention, the right to life, so on and so forth. There's been less focus on economic, social and cultural rights, but this is by no means less important. The right to health care, or to the highest attainable standard of health care, is included in the ICSCR. The right to education is another example where it kind of branches over both areas. So kind of making this very distinct differentiation between civil political rights and economic, social and cultural rights is not very useful, I think, in this context. Then we have specific treaties relating to the experience of women. And I include women here because girls grow up into women. And in armed conflict, their experience as children in armed conflict will shape then their rights as women afterwards as well. And so these repeat in many ways the same rights that are included in the universal instruments, but they recognize that there are still problems, there is still discrimination, and then give specific obligations that need to be addressed in those contexts. So CEDAW has provisions relating to the experience of rural women, for example. The CRC, I think, is very important in the recognition of the development of the child. So we see vulnerabilities of children in armed conflict being very different, older children being vulnerable to more violent breaches, or in the case of girls, potentially in relation to forced marriage, etc. Younger children, as we see tragically within the conflict in Gaza right now, have a much more differentiated experience when it comes to starvation. The longer term impacts of starvation on young children in armed conflict is devastating. And as we've also seen in Gaza, lack of inoculation against different diseases, devastating effects for the rest of their lives, but also then having a much bigger societal impact as well. So the best place I always think to start when we're looking at these rights is the prohibition of discrimination. And as I said, we're getting better at understanding the differentiated experience of women. So in Ukraine, there's been a huge documentation of the experience of older women. But there's also, and I've included the Refugee Convention here, but there are other conventions relating to human trafficking, for example, that are very relevant, particularly for migrant women, asylum seekers, and internally displaced persons. And as well, I think the Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness is very important to note, given the experience of children, for example, in Syria, where children cannot inherit their mother's nationality, and then it being very difficult to evidence who the father is, potentially because they are away fighting or have been killed. And then you end up in a situation where the child is stateless, and in an armed conflict where the situation changes very quickly and the children and mother may be forced to flee an area very quickly, evidencing nationality is very important for access to healthcare, access to education, so on and so forth. So you can see how this is a very interconnected web of rights and rights violations in this. I would also say as well, I've not included here the Istanbul Convention on relating to domestic violence. Domestic violence, we see, has a propensity to increase in all conflicts. You have a violent situation, all other violent crimes do increase. And so these conventions are also important. We have regional protections as well. So that being the Istanbul Convention is a Council of Europe instrument. Other states can sign on to it, though. But we have the African system, where there is a specific protocol on women's rights and children's rights. And we have other instruments relevant in the Inter-American system as well. So it's a very dense web, I would say. And then we add on the added layer of protection of international humanitarian law. So international humanitarian law is only applicable in armed conflict. So once the armed conflict is broken out, be it armed violence between states or protracted and organized violence between a non-state actor and the state or another non-state actor, and we've reached this level of intensity and organization, we have either an international armed conflict or a non-international armed conflict. And these instruments are extremely important. The majority of provisions relate to international armed conflicts. So the Geneva Conventions in their whole apply to international armed conflicts. And then we have Common Article 3 and then the second additional protocol applicable to non-international armed conflicts as well. These provisions include specific protections for women generally, and then specific groups of women. So there is rights, there's specific protections or rights for women who are have infant children or are pregnant. There are specific rights for women who have been detained, be they prisoners of war, so combatants, so people fighting in the armed conflicts. And we also have specific rights of children as well within there. And very interestingly within that, when it comes to occupation, as we see right now in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, and also in the situation between Israel and Palestine, and potentially will develop when it comes to Lebanon. So very important rights when it comes to education, tracing, making sure that children actually are cared for by their family. There are family rights within international humanitarian law. And all the rights generally, I would say as well, it's very important to remember that women and children enjoy the general protections applicable to civilians. So there's a huge density of rights that we need to look at when we're looking at this, particularly the protections. Most of international humanitarian law is written in a neutral manner. It doesn't relate to women, children, men, boys, anyone. It applies to everyone. However, it's always important, obviously, to read these protections and understand them in the context in which they apply, and then applying a gendered perspective. This is an area that the ICRC has done a lot of work on. They have 2 very interesting reports on particularly how this is operationalized within militaries. How can they do this as well as the people who are actually fighting the armed conflict? International humanitarian law, there is an old body of law. So the Geneva Conventions come from 1949. They bring with them the experiences of World War II, and that's very important, I think, given the global scale of that conflict as well. However, they were written in 1949. Our understanding in this field is very different today, and so there are some aspects that do come with kind of stereotypes and age-old perceptions written in. So when the right of protection of women under the additional protocol relates to their honour, and we have references to honour and indecent assault being these kind of age-old ideas about women and children. However, they do, whilst there are some problems with some of the language, I think it's still important to remember we are applying them in a current context with our current understandings. So that's very important. The final thing I thought would be important to highlight is, so each of the treaties that I was talking about before, most of the treaties I was talking about before have what's called a treaty body attached to them. So a body that monitors the implementation of this, and they provide general recommendations. So the CEDAW committee has given a general recommendation on women in conflict, prevention, conflict, and post-conflict situations. So it covers the whole spectrum from peace to peace building and everything in between. And how the convention applies in those different situations. And then we have the UN Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security. These are very important documents. So we can trace back from the Beijing Declaration in 1995 that recognized that women's rights are human rights, explicitly articulating this, and then the developments we've seen in the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, and now we've had just the Summit for the Future at the General Assembly. So we can see a trend in this, but the main thing that the Women, Peace and Security resolutions do is recognizing the differentiated impact on different genders and groups within armed conflict, and recognizing that that is an issue for international peace and security. So when you're looking for the rights, you look to the conventions. But what the UN Security Council resolutions do is they operationalize certain aspects of that. So they include requirements, for example, to have a national plan, a national action plan, which many countries now do for the realization of these rights. They include requirements in relation to establishing ways of accounting for sexual and gender-based violence. And many other things in between. But it is the rights are established in the treaties first, and then we have this kind of add-on extra from the UN Security Council resolutions. So that was a whirlwind tour from me right now. I will hand the floor over to others. Thank you.
First off, I want to say thank you, Jean, for this very insightful mini lecture. And we actually have time if anyone has a question for Jean. If you have a question, you can just raise your hand. Otherwise, you can save it because we also have the Q&A later on. But anyone has a question? Then I have a question. So I'm curious, are you currently involved in any research projects? And in that case, what are you doing right now?
Well, I have a lot of research projects, but none specific on gendered aspects, but it's an element that comes up in absolutely everything that you need to think about. And I would say that's something that within the Swedish Defence Research Agency, we specifically have to take into account the different gendered aspects of our work. So right now we're just starting on a project on artificial intelligence in the military systems. And it's really interesting because there's not very much research on this. The research that's coming is from the civilian side. And what you can see is a significant impact and differentiation between women and girls and boys and men, particularly when it comes to bias. So you have bias in the data, but you have many different types of bias. So you can have bias in the data, you can have bias in the algorithm, you can have bias in the kind of machine learning that is going on, you have bias, cognitive bias from the user. So one point that was brought up as an example is where the tool that you're using will produce a result. And the example was given of a black combatant in World War II, for example, and the user says, no, this is wrong, because they have a bias. They are looking at it through a white lens, whereas we know, obviously, that has happened. And then we have other examples of, like even basic things of where you wash your hands and the kind of the automatic detection, things like that, not recognizing different colors of skin. And so on and so forth, and how these all then have a significant impact. And then when you add on the layer of military, it's a little bit scary, I'll be quite honest with you. So
that's very interesting. I didn't expect that. But a huge thank you for being here today. A big round of applause.
Thank you.
Yes, so now it's time for today's panel discussion. So I am delighted to introduce our distinguished panelists. And first I want to welcome Ulla Möller, the Director of the Nordic Representation Office of the United Nations Population Fund in Copenhagen. She has traveled all the way from Copenhagen today to be here with us. So a big round of applause to Ulla. Next, we're also honored to have Jean Casey, the research manager at Girls Not Brides from London, who has traveled all the way from London to be here with us. So a big round of applause for Jean. But before we dive into the discussions, I just want to ask you to briefly introduce yourself, your work, and the organization that you are working for, and specifically in regards to girls' rights in conflict and crisis settings. So, Ulla, would you like to start introduction? Oh, of course, yeah. Then Jean starts. Oh, yeah, sorry. Should be working. Yeah, perfect.
That's great. And it's a real pleasure to be here today. And I hope we're going to have a really good dialogue, and it would be really great to hear from all you guys as well and hear your questions. So my name is Jean. I'm the research manager at Girls Not Brides, the global partnership to end child marriage. I work broadly on the research agenda, coordinating a research agenda to end child marriage. And parts of that work includes looking at the research and evidence across the conflict and crisis affected areas. For those of you that don't know Girls Not Brides, the global partnership to end child marriage, it's a collection of about 1,400 members, mostly civil society. We also have members from INGOs, with our friends from the UN agencies, donors, etc. So we're really kind of broad group of stakeholders, but mostly I think the essence of our work is responding to civil society organizations, including women rights organizations, young women's organizations, youth-led, etc. We have a common goal, and that's to end child marriage. And we do that working across very many different kind of areas. So working, for example, on the institutional, the policy, the legal, also working on the structural, so making sure services are there and responding to the needs of girls, working very much with communities, and obviously working with girls and their families as well. I have a short video which explains what we do way better than I do, so maybe we can play that.
Yeah.
We are the leaders of the movement to end child marriage.
We are diverse,
strong
y colaborativas.
आज हर 3 सेकंड में एक लड़की की शादी हो जाती है.
Esto implica millones de niñas y adolescentes en el mundo.
We are part of Girls Not Brides,
the global partnership to end child marriage.
Girls Not Brides supports,
influences,
amplifica,
shares knowledge,
convenes,
mobilizes.
हम स्थानीय, क्षेत्रीय, राष्ट्रीय, वैश्विक स्तर पर प्रगति लाते हैं.
We work together in coalition and partnership to hold governments to account,
to create change for girls and young women,
so that they can live their lives free from child marriage.
We believe
that no single person or an organization
can take the lead.
Girls Not Brides is supporting organizations globally with hundreds of trailblazing leaders
like me
and me.
और मैं.
Pertenecientes a comunidades de todo el mundo.
We know that to achieve wide-scale change, we need committed leaders,
paving the way for a better world.
I am the movement.
मैं आंदोलन हूँ.
I am the movement.
I am the movement.
I am the movement.
And together, we are building a world where gender equality is a reality.
Where girls have freedom,
agency,
and power to make choices about their own lives.
We are the movement to end child marriage.
So, yeah, much better than I can say it. But I think just one thing to underline here is that our work is very much centered on collective action. So really thinking about the movement, which is why this messaging comes through very strongly. And over to you, Ulla.
Thank you. So my name is Ulla, and I work for UNFPA, which is the Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency in the United Nations family. And what we do is a lot. We have 3 transformative goals that we aim to achieve by 2030. And the first one is to end preventable maternal deaths. And that may sound in a Swedish context like, yeah, really? But I don't know if you know how many passengers is in a jumbo jet. Do you know? Around 400, right? So 2 jumbo jets every day is crashing in the Atlantic Ocean. That's the amount of women dying every day from preventable causes. And if those jets had fallen into the sea, there would be an outcry. But because they are women, like the ones we just saw, it seems that it's very, very difficult to get attention to that. And I've dedicated my entire career not to the UN, but to women and their reproductive health. The second transformative goal is to end unmet need for contraception. We firmly believe, based on the Cairo Conference on Population and Development in 1994, 30 years ago, that a woman has a right to make decisions about her own body. Agency starts with your right to decide who touches you, who talks about you, and how many children do you want? Do you want any at all? And when do you want them? That's just fundamental for equality. And then we also have the third goal, which is to end gender-based violence and harmful practices. Child marriage is a harmful practice, because we know the impact it has on a girl if she's forced off in an early marriage. There is a lot of things about the language, and we do call it child marriage or early marriage, but in some context it is also forced marriage. And that, coming back to the right to freely choose your own spouse is really important and fundamental also to what we do. We're one of the agencies who have dual mandates, so we work in humanitarian settings and conflict settings, protracted crisis, emerging crisis, active warfare, and you're going to hear something, I think, from our Ukraine office a little bit later. But we also work in development. So we are in almost 200 countries across the world. And the strength it has to have, a dual mandate is actually that we have trust in the communities. We would have a well-established connection with governments, and we work through governments. It's the UN. We work through recognized governments. And in Ukraine, what that enables us to do is really fast be on the ground with services for women. And I think we might talk a little bit more about the specifics. But what continues to come back to us is that piece about women's role in society, about women's agency, and about the Vienna Declaration that all human rights you cannot divide them. They are all interconnected. One right is not more important than the other. And that is, again, fundamental for a lot of the advocacy we do when we work with governments. But something as simple as having access to contraception is life-saving. And very often we don't think about that. What you need to know about me is that I'm not a very polished diplomat. I've only been in the UN for 5 years. Before that I was an activist, and then I became civil society advocate. So it's been kind of a journey. But I am in the United Nations by choice. Because I think in today's world, we do need the United Nations. When you look around you and see the world that is, we are funded on World War II, and to some extent also on World War I. And that is in our preamble, and some of you heard me say this before, is that we are put in this world, regardless of what agency we work for, we are part of the United Nations. And we are here to save future generations from the scourge of war. And we are never stronger than the member states. So it's really important that we have strong, supportive member states who is getting behind us and standing behind us so that we can deliver our mandate. And I think maybe I want to close with 2 things. The first is I'm going to step a little bit out of context. I'm sorry about that. No. But can I ask you all just to take a deep breath and then settle into this seat you're in. Close your eyes, just 10 seconds. And just think about what you can do today when you leave this room to support peace in this world. Thank you, and try and hold that feeling with you when you listen to the stories you're going to hear. And then think about the difference we can make as individuals. And I'll close by quoting a great Swede called Dag Hammarskjöld. And I recently visited his crash site in Zambia. He died for peace. And he said the UN is not put in this world to take humanity to heaven. We are here to save it from going to hell.
Thank you for the introduction, both of you. And we want to start the panel discussion by giving you a bit of an overview. So my first question is for you, Ulla. You can drink some water, take a minute. But could you please provide an overview of why women and girls are especially vulnerable in conflict and war situations? And what factors contribute to the heightened risk exposure? And additionally, how does the UNFPA addresses these challenges in war and conflict settings?
And what, you're giving me 2 minutes? No.
No, yes, sorry. No.
So when crisis comes, when it happens, it really uproots entire societies and communities. And that means that you're very often underrun within a matter of hours. And you take nothing with you. Your societal structures break down, your community structures break down. And very often women and girls are the ones who are also left behind because the men are out fighting. And we do know that 80% of displaced people are women, and they're the ones most affected. We also know that it's also about 80% is the number of casualties in war and amongst the civilians. When societies break down, their infrastructure, access to social services also break down. They leave their schools, they leave their health facilities, they leave the safety of a home, very often also the safety of a man. And we may think that's a weird thing to have safety of a man, but in many communities and societies that is really important. The protection framework breaks down because the police and the military who's there to protect you are all of a sudden absent and you're running. So in that means that with no health, and this is another surprise for many people, is that women continue to deliver babies when there's a conflict. And they no longer have access to safe delivery. And to give you an example of what that means is, it means that they are lying on rubbles in a random place, delivering without any skilled person, no midwives, not even a skilled birth attendant to help them. Probably a traditional birth helper. And if anything happens, there's no referral, there's no hospital nearby, and they will die. So it really risks the life of the mother. Another thing that happens is, then you all know this, gender-based violence increases significantly. And that's again, the protection systems are gone. Gender-based violence is a weapon of war. So rape is rampant. But it is also, for some women and young girls, it is about coping mechanisms, survival mechanisms. If you haven't eaten for a week, you will sell your body for a small portion of rice or beans. Many years ago I was in, this is in 1994, so now I'm also revealing I'm really old compared to most of you. I was in the big refugee camps in Kigoma in Tanzania. And I have a photo, I should have brought it with me actually, of a graffiti on the wall. Because commercial sex work, negative coping mechanism was a big thing. And it was the same time where HIV was still very prevalent. And the graffiti says, rather die from HIV in 10 years than starvation tomorrow. And that's the choices women are facing in crisis and conflict. And very often we are not aware of it. Menstrual hygiene. How do you keep menstrual hygiene when you have no access to water, no sanitary pads, no toilet facilities? You can't. How do you make sure that as a young girl that you can go safely to the toilet? First of all, you're lucky if you're in a camp that actually has a toilet. So you go to the bush or you go to the rubbles. There's no light, there's no protection. Or you're in a camp, in an IDP camp or refugee camp, where there's no lights on the pathway to your bathroom and toilets. There's no segregation. The vulnerability at all levels increases. And this is something you have to bear in mind. It's not only for young children, it's also for adult women. You spoke a lot about women. And whatever they experience, whether it's a young child or an adult, that's the trauma that they're going to carry for life. And we have to take that responsibility at heart. I can talk a lot more about this, and I'm thinking I might get the word again at some point. So I'm going to stop here, and hopefully also when we get to the Q&A, we can have a bit more of an in-depth conversation. But we cannot underestimate the vulnerability. And maybe before I stop saying what we hear today with Girls Not Brides, is that the risk of early child marriage increases significantly. In many settings, parents also see it as a way of protecting their girl child. They think it makes them safer to have a husband who can look after them and give them food than it is for them to be on the run. And that is a nuance that we often don't talk about. I very often meet perceptions that this is just because this is cultural and traditional, probably also religious. It's not religious, may I add. Sometimes it's just circumstances of families who are desperate. And I've yet to meet parents who doesn't want the best for the child.
Thank you, Ulla. And as you mentioned, you sent me a video earlier this week showcasing the important work UNFPA is doing in Ukraine right now. So we're going to take a short moment to look at the video.
Ladies and gentlemen, greetings from Ukraine. During conflicts, natural disasters and public health emergencies, sexual and reproductive health needs are often overlooked, with life-threatening consequences. Pregnant women face dangerous complications without access to emergency care, and women and girls lose access to family planning, leading to unintended pregnancies in difficult conditions. They also become more vulnerable to sexual violence, exploitation, and HIV infection. UNFPA is on the ground before, during, and after a crisis hits. We work with governments, NGOs, and other partners to ensure that sexual reproductive health and gender-based violence responses are integrated into emergency efforts. The ongoing war has devastated infrastructure, displaced millions, and posed severe challenges to those remaining. The war in Ukraine has had a catastrophic impact on women and girls, disrupting health services and leaving many without essential care. The risks, forms, and occurrence of GBV have increased since the full-scale invasion in 2022. Our projects are tailored to addressing the underlying causes of violence and aim to prevent and mitigate GBV and provide life-saving services to survivors. The ongoing continuing attacks on civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, maternity wards, endanger pregnant women and newborns. In response to this new reality, UNFPA has had to introduce innovative solutions. For example, mobile sexual and SRH services. These mobile teams provide integrated services directly to affected communities, particularly in remote areas and locations close to the front line. The deployment of mobile incubators, which are equipped with their own power source. They ensure the safe transport and care for newborns during power outages. The incubators keep babies safe and alive amidst aerial attacks. The idea of developing a maternity ward in a bunker in Kherson is to respond to the conflict realities. It offers a safe space for women to give birth during air raids and attacks. As the war persists, UNFPA is shifting from an urgent need to a sustainable response. We're investing in social systems, including in the national police, to ensure they remain operational and responsive. Strengthening the capacity of national and local actors is central to this approach. However, without international support, Ukraine's healthcare and social services risk collapse. UNFPA is forging partnerships with other UN agencies to ensure the maximum impact on the ground for the people in need. The women, peace and security agenda is critical. If women are excluded due to GBV or lack of sexual reproductive rights, they cannot contribute to Ukraine's recovery. UNFPA is committed to supporting women and girls as key agents of change, ensuring their active participation in the rebuilding of their country. Women-led organizations, women rights organizations are key partners in strengthening women's human capital. These organizations know their communities the best. They ensure a conflict-sensitive approach, and they integrate humanitarian principles and promote gender equality. This year alone, 16 out of the 20 UNFPA implementing partners are Ukrainian women-led organizations, the majority being women rights organizations. Lastly, I would like to highlight the courage of our national and international personnel. They are working under dangerous conditions, often forced to take shelter during consecutive air raids. Without their dedication, our operations will not be possible. As we continue to navigate this conflict crisis, our key ask is to maintain and whatever possible increase the support to UNFPA's work in Ukraine. The needs are immense, the funding gaps are significant. Highlighting the voices of women is central. Together, we build resilience, we restore dignity, and we lay the groundwork for recovery. Thank you.
Yes. So thank you for that video. Ulla shared with us an overview of why girls and women are extra vulnerable in war and crisis-affected countries. But Jean, could you expand on the specific situation of child marriage in conflict and crisis-affected settings? What does the latest data tell us about the prevalence of child marriage in these contexts?
Yeah, sure, thanks. I think I have a couple of slides for this. But building on what Ulla unpacked there, I think the drivers are very similar in relation to child marriage. They're just amplified. For example, as Ulla was mentioning, the education structures shut down, and education is one of the most protective factors to prevent child marriage. Also access to SRHR, so access to the contraception. There's also increased threat of violence, sexual violence. So families prefer to keep their children at home. And also, as Ulla was mentioning, sometimes in terms of economic instability, people decide to marry their children off. So it's a lot of the same drivers that we see in the development context, but these are very much exacerbated. And this you can see from some of the statistics that we have. So child marriage is currently almost double the global average in conflict in some form of fragility settings. And over 1 in 3 girls in contexts considered fragile are married before the age of 18. So that's 1 in 3. So in terms of urgency in addressing this issue, it's really imperative and urgent. And I've got a couple more slides a couple more statistics on the next slide. And I think the other thing that we're seeing in the current context is we're seeing increases in terms of the climate crisis. We're seeing global health risks like COVID and Ebola. So then we have a situation where there are compounding crises, and we sometimes call these polycrises. And so this intersection again exacerbates the risk of child marriage in these settings. And then the kind of on the other side of that, we're also battling with the reality that less than 1% of humanitarian assistance goes to on GBV in humanitarian settings, and child marriage will fall into that, but we don't know exactly what portion of that goes to child marriage. So that's just a little bit of scene setting on child marriage in conflict and crisis settings.
Thank you. I have one more question for you, Jean. You have recently been working on a new report. Yeah. Reviewing the latest evidence addressing child marriage in crisis-affected context. Why was it important for Girls Not Brides to produce this specific report? And can you share with us some of the findings of the report?
Sure. Okay. Actually, we are launching this report today. So this is my first time talking about it, so it's really good to be with you all here. So obviously, as I mentioned earlier, the global partnership will respond to the priorities of our civil society members working in the regions and at a national level, importantly. And so recently the priorities have been shifting because a lot of our members and partners have been noticing that they're working more in conflicts and crisis-affected settings because conflicts are spreading, crises are spreading. So women's rights organizations, youth groups, civil society, they're stepping into these spaces. Often women's rights organizations and CSOs are the first to respond when it comes to GBV. And then what they were finding is they're not integrated in any of the it's hard for them to get integrated into the prevention and response systems, but what they were really needing is some technical information on, what do we do in these situations, what works. So the knowledge of what works on child marriage in conflict and crisis-affected settings is very nascent. In the development sphere, it's much more advanced. We have much better body of evidence, and we have much stronger indicators of what's working and what's not working. In this area, in this context, we don't know that much. There's less than a handful of evaluations that tell us what works and what doesn't work in these settings. So we set about trying to pull together, looking at the evidence over the last 4 years and pulling together, okay, out of all this evidence, how do we make it most useful for those actors working on these issues? So we organized all the evidence around the different sectors. So say if you're working on SRHR or mental health or education or economic instability or food security. And we pulled out of this evidence what is the most kind of solution-focused And so to try and make sure that the key takeaways are accessible, and then that there's tools to show you, okay, now I know this is likely, it's going to be a good thing to integrate into the design of my program or to use for advocacy, but how do I do that? So this is a response bringing together not just the evidence, but also the real practical element. So, yeah, how do we action this? In terms of some of the findings, I'll probably, because of time purposes, I'll do just a blend. I think one of the things that comes out very strongly, and I know Ulla, you said this as well, is the importance of safe spaces for adolescent girls. So the literature, even though the evidence isn't really clear on how effective it is, again and again it's coming up in the research as the critical kind of space for girls to feel safe and to access other services. So importantly as well, it's a gateway to SRHR, comprehensive sexual education as well. It's also a space for accessing kind of support for mental health. Mental health is something that we're seeing come out more and more across the evidence as well. And we're seeing that, like, for example, girls being in other networks, so being with other girls and being with peers is really helping to address and support girls in times of trauma. And then as well, we're seeing in terms of education, obviously, Ulla was saying as well, the education structures break down. There's also a digital divide, so even if the education moves online for kind of gender reasons, then girls don't have as much access to digital devices. And so we're really trying to also kind of encourage the working of the protection and the education system, because we know that child marriage, that the education is a great protector of child marriage. So how do we strengthen the practical, or address practical barriers like the licensing to the schools, the uniforms, etc., but also those structural ones where girls move into communities and they're undocumented, so they can't attend schools. I think as well the SRHR is another critical one that I mentioned, but we are seeing, and it was good to see the mobile clinics there, because that's one of the areas that's coming up very strong in the evidence. That there are creative ways to get SRHR to young girls and those that are most marginalised. And I think the other element that's coming across strong is that there needs to also be an economic element in terms of multi-component programming to address child marriage in these settings. Girls want to know, they want to build their income generation opportunities. They want to know that they can take these skills and then use them to create income as well. And I think I'll wrap up there because I think we're a little bit tight on time.
Yes, thank you. So my next question is for you, Ulla, UNFPA. And I think the video mentioned it a bit, but could you please elaborate on how does the UNFPA address long-term sexual and reproductive health and rights issues in conflict zones, and what are the major obstacles in implementing programs effectively?
Okay, thank you. So I think first of all, I mean, it is, as you saw, Max, he doesn't sleep. And I think that's another thing. I really just want to, it's very good that I'm sitting here, but he should be the one sitting here. The people who is in Kiev right now, they just don't sleep. And I think that's another strength of the UN, because we tend to stay. But sorry, I just wanted to shout out for Max because he's amazing. Yeah. But what we do is, you saw that we do mobile clinics, and we do that all over the world actually. It doesn't matter whether it's in Nigeria, where I were most recently, or in India, in Bangladesh when there's flooding, in crisis in Ukraine, in Gaza. We also, to the extent we have access, using mobile clinics. Simply because then we can move to where people are, and not where they live, because that's not necessarily the same thing, but where they are. And then we have a full-fledged clinic with us with everything we need, including a generator that enables us to actually run it and provide the services that is needed. We also make sure that to the extent possible, that we actually have trained. You saw we've built a delivery ward in a bunker in Ukraine, So to the extent we possibly can, we will build in those safe spaces, not only for gender-based violence, I'll come to that in a minute, but to make sure that there's a clean space for women. Where that is not possible, like in Gaza, we will have dignity kits that we will hand out to pregnant women. So that's a bit of a combination approach there. But there they would carry around, their own. And then they would at least have a minimum of something clean they can put under them when they deliver. We are also doing interagency packages where we work with WHO and UNICEF and everyone else to get equipment into whatever health system is there. Whether that is in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Nigeria, in Bangladesh, it's not important, but we try and build it in. And that's about the sustainability of the response. So if there is a structure, even how fragile it is, we will work through the government structures because that's where the sustainability lies. But we will use that as almost as a hub and spokes approach where we make sure that we can all the time come out and reach people where they are. You heard me say this earlier today, but I just want to say in Gaza right now, we don't have anesthesia. And I don't know if you can imagine what it's like for a woman to have a cesarean without anesthesia. That is the grim reality right now. So we're trying to prevent that. We're trying to make sure that we do have what is needed to help women have safe deliveries. What else do? We make sure that there's access to contraception. Because people still have sex, also consensual sex, while they're running. Yeah. And if we're just even slightly human, you can understand how nice that must be to feel loved and have consensual sex when your entire world is crashing down on you. That does not mean you want another mouth to feed. So we are really trying very hard to make sure that rights and choices is carried with women throughout their route. Then we are what is called we own the area of responsibility for gender-based violence. And that means in humanitarian assistance we are responsible to coordinate and ensure that there is a response to gender-based violence. And we are also the provider of last resort. Part of that is capturing the data, making sure that we know what does it look like. We also capture data on child marriage and on FGM in that process. And it's also trying to solicit funding and safeguard funding. It is the most underfunded area of all is gender-based violence and harmful practices. It's very, very difficult because it's not perceived as life-saving. And again, many women will die, but you will also have that trauma they carry with you and its entire future lost, right? And it impacts the entire next generation and probably the following one also. So gender-based violence is a big thing, and safe spaces where women come and they will have opportunities for livelihood. They'll learn handcrafts and we will help them access markets and see if we can sell it, and also access psychosocial support for trauma treatment, which is critical regardless of what crisis you're in. I think that was a really helicopter view, but I think I covered most.
It worked perfect, and it actually answered my second question, so I can ask Jean directly now my questions, so thank you. But I'm curious to learn more about how does Girls Not Brides collaborate with its member organization to address child marriage and support married girls in context where there's war and conflict happening.
Yeah, thanks for that. As I mentioned, we very much respond to the priorities of our members. And just to reiterate, we're not a humanitarian organisation, so our contributions are very much in the technical area. So in terms of how we support their work, very much in terms of like this piece of research that I just showed, which was came out as a priority across our members to learn more about what works in these settings. So that's really then our contribution then in that sense is to take this, make sure that the evidence is accessible, and then that is used to inform the programs. So if I'm doing safe space programming on the ground, what can I learn from this to make sure that my safe space, it's very hard to say safe space fast, is really effective in addressing child marriage. And also it's important you said supporting the needs of married girls, because often the programs can often be targeting girls to prevent child marriage, but then once the girls get married, they're no longer included in the program. So what do we need to make sure that girls who are mothers, who are married, who are divorced, that they're also included in programs, that they're also included in pathways to go back to education. So that's a really important aspect as well. And then as well, using evidence, how do we strengthen our collective advocacy? So for this report, for example, we engaged with lots of our members, we engaged with our partners, SAVE, Plan, I think Plan is here as well. We had conversations with our friends from the UN, and we tried to come up with like advocacy asks that resonate, that have traction, that people can use and adapt for their context. And the same goes for trying to influence the policy sphere as well. And then I think the other thing we do is we really try and address research gaps. So in the Horn of Africa, we know very little about what's happening there in terms of child marriage. So we just conducted a literature review, but then it's always about not stopping at the evidence, it's how to make it actionable. And from that, we built a roadmap with some of the members there, and then we're going to use that roadmap to start trying to understand how to address child marriage in these settings. There's lots more, but I'm the research person, so I'm probably just a little bit biased on my answers.
Yeah. But you mentioned advocacy, so I want to take the time to invite Sophia Lane, the Advocacy and Campaign Officer at Girls Not Brides, to join us on stage. So a big round of applause for Sophia Lane. So I just want to ask if you could elaborate on Girls Not Brides advocacy work at the international level towards ending child marriage, and what global advocacy opportunities are there to influence policy changes and drive commitments from governments and global institutions to prioritize ending marriage, child marriage, especially in conflict and crisis affected settings.
Thanks, Malin. I'm conscious about how much time we have left, so I apologise if I skip over some of the details, but I'll do my best to be succinct. I actually have quite a lot of notes here. So I'll just start with a caveat that, as Jean said, Girls Not Brides is not a humanitarian organisation, so I'll be speaking on our global advocacy work on ending child marriage more generally. But that being said, it is connected very much with many themes and rights. So a lot of the key areas we work on are relevant to conflict and crises affected settings. So one key area of our work is influencing the politically negotiated texts in key advocacy, global advocacy spaces. So for example, the agreed conclusions at the Commission on the Status of Women, which this year focused on poverty and financing with a gender perspective, the UN Commission on Population and Development, which focused on SRHR, and recently the Pact for the Future, where we actually secured a specific recognition of child early and forced marriage as a form of violence against women and girls. And so this is really important because it acts as an essential hook and leverage for organisations and partners that we work with at the national level to use in their own advocacy efforts as well. And another example of this is the Global Ending Violence Against Children Ministerial Conference that Katerina mentioned and that Girls Not Brides is engaged in. So we're supporting member organisations to lobby their governments to develop a pledge focusing on addressing child marriage, and also to secure from governments commitments around the political document that they will adopt to recognise child marriage in that as well. So we also support member organisations to engage in leveraging key UN human rights mechanisms. So for example, submitting shadow reports with key recommendations to end child marriage. And so in all of these areas, we work to facilitate the engagement of our members in the global advocacy spaces. So again, this ensures that the advocacy work being carried out at national and local level really feeds into the international spaces. So there's this influence from the top down as well as from the bottom up. So in terms of the global advocacy opportunities to end child marriage in conflict and crisis-affected settings, I wanted to highlight 3 of the key UN human rights mechanisms that can be leveraged, especially for CSOs working in this space. So this includes engaging with the relevant UN treaty bodies, which are the international committees of independent experts who monitor the implementation of the core international human rights treaties by state parties. So, for example, those that Sally mentioned before. So especially the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the Committee on the Rights of the Child. So this can really support the respective committees' awareness and understanding of key issues, which they can take into account when they issue their concluding observations to the states, which includes their recommendations. Another key area would be engaging in and reporting to the Universal Periodic Review. So this is a peer review process where states review each other's human rights records and issue recommendations, including on efforts to address child marriage. And so, for example, one of the states that's coming up for review under the Universal Periodic Review next year is Niger, which currently has the highest prevalence of child marriage in the world, and it's a country that has seen, that we know is experiencing protracted humanitarian crises. So it's a key opportunity to ensure that states issue targeted recommendations to Niger. And then finally, I would also mention leveraging the UN special procedures. So these are the independent human rights experts and bodies that are responsible for reporting or advising on human rights. So especially the Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, the Special Reporter on Violence Against Women and Girls, and there's also the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. So engagement with these special procedures can include submissions in advance of country visits to relevant states, and also reaching out to encourage them to issue statements and write letters to governments responding on emerging issues. So, for example, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls recently wrote a letter regarding the personal status bill in Iraq, which is threatening girls' rights in terms of child marriage as well.
Thank you, Sophia. Yeah, we're a bit short of time, but I wanted to ask Ulla one of the last questions. And you mentioned before, and we also heard it in the video, that there are gaps in the fundings when it comes to the UNFPA's work. But I'm also wondering what additional support the UNFPA requires, such as resources, partnerships, or policy changes to strengthen its efforts in safeguarding and promoting girls' and women's rights in conflict-affected settings, such as Ukraine.
So I don't have a hard stop. So if people are fine to stay 10 minutes, I'm fine to stay 10 minutes. I think resources is a real issue, and what we need is flexible resources that we can move from crisis to crisis. There's a tendency globally now. Money is coming down. The war in Ukraine, of course, is absorbing a lot of funding and resources, and that means that the flexible funding that we need in all the forgotten crises, and there's a lot of forgotten crises. There's Sudan, there's the Sahel, there's Niger, Burkina Faso, Bangladesh has floodings, there's Syria, there's Yemen. I can continue, this list is long. And what we really need is for everyone to look up and look out. I know Ukraine is in our back garden, but 9 million people in Sudan, right now, displaced, lacking basic services, and we cannot move funding that we cannot necessarily. This is not just UNFPA, this is global when you look at the funding going into these crises that had all the attention. We cannot move a penny, not €1, from one of those crises to help people in the other crisis. I think we are asking for trust in our partnerships and trust us to do the right thing. And the right thing for us is not about who do we support. We do not take sides. We are solely and firmly on the sides of civilians in the United Nations. and civilians should not be suffering because a small group, very often a small group of men, can't decide who is most powerful. We should not have people dying for that reason. We should not have children in Gaza really facing starvation. We should also not have hospitals bombed in Kiev. But we should also not have girls married away in Sudan or dying of starvation in the Sahel. We can build a better world, but people, and I think, I've been abroad for 30 years, okay? I've come back to Scandinavia a year ago. And I am lost for words when I see how people, citizens, have forgotten they have a voice. I left a region where human rights were not negotiable, and where civilians, people like you, would hold their own government accountable to the human rights law that they have freely signed up to. Human rights is not for pick and choose. They are universal, and they are here for a reason. And I'm wondering what happened to our democracies. Democracy is the backbone of creating a world where we are leaving no one behind. So I think that is what I really need is us to think about. That's why I also asked you to think about what is your role? Because we all have a role. And that's how we build partnerships. Recognizing the one thing that binds us all together is humanity. It doesn't matter where we come from. It's not important. We have the same needs. No matter where you're from, whether you have a disability or not, you live, you laugh, you love, you cry, you get angry, you have joy. You're exactly the same. And I think we need the world to believe that. And that belief starts in each and every one of us. And then we need strong partnerships like we do in our joint programs. We have the coalition, we have the networks, so that we start working across everywhere where we are. But it starts here. What do you believe in? What do you think is right? That's where it starts. I'm not sure I answered your question, but I gave an opinion, didn't I?
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you. So I want to end this panel discussion with one final question for all of you. And that is, as we look to the future, what are the most critical areas for international collaboration to protect and promote girls' rights in conflict-affected contexts? And I know we're ending right now, so if you need to go, you can sneak out, but we're going to extend for like 10 minutes to give you also the opportunity to ask some questions. But yes.
Yeah, it's really hard to follow what you just shared there. So
sorry.
I was trying to think.
Yeah, I can say the question again.
I guess I can speak about what do we know from practice, what do we know from evidence, what would make a difference. Definitely partnerships, right? So I think that's really, we can't, as you saw from the video that I shared, we can't do it all. We're better together. And those partnerships need different types of stakeholders, right? So we very much need to have women's rights organizations at the tables. We need youth-led organization, and we also need, that engagement with policymakers, with governments, with our UN friends, with our international NGOs, civil society. So we need diverse partnerships. We need to have a common mission and a common vision. The issue of child marriage, you saw there with the data, it's quite staggering if you translate the data and you look at it in conflict and crisis settings. Yet very few people are getting behind this. Very few donors. It's very difficult for the sectors to work coordinated on this issue. So we really need the sectors to come together. So the education, the food security, WASH, we need the SRHR folk, we need everybody. Because child marriage and girls' rights, right? It's a complicated issue. It's not like you have one right here and it doesn't matter if you have the other right. You need all the rights, and you need them as you grow through your life, through the trajectory. And I would also say that we need commitment from the donors. You've seen, like Ulla's talked about, the funding and also the small amount of funding that goes to GBV as well. We need core funding, flexible funding. I would say that civil society needs funding because, as I said, women's rights organizations, civil societies, they're the first to often step into these spaces. They need to be funded, and they need to know that they can fund their work not just for 2 months, but in a sustainable form. And I think beyond that, we just need to believe and have commitment and to all get behind it. And we all have a part to play, so let's jump in, I say.
Thanks, Malin, and thanks, Jean. I concur a lot with what Gina's just said. I was going to emphasize as well the importance of establishing and engaging in strategic, multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder, and multi-level partnerships, like you mentioned, and in a way that brings together the various strengths of the different stakeholders. So with the government agencies, that includes the influencing power that they bring in the international and the national spaces, as well as you mentioned, the all-critical, sustainable, long-term and flexible funding, and particularly for the other key stakeholders being CSOs, so funding for those that are community, women and youth-led, and that have the locally informed expertise on the impact of conflict and crises on girls' rights, and also of UN bodies, which serve as the facilitating mechanism for the multi-partner and global collaboration efforts, as well as providing the technical expertise. So,
I think I have nothing further to add, but it is about collaboration, and it is about understanding that no one can do anything alone. It's about, but I think it's also firmly standing behind multilateralism. And we see more and more pushback on multilateralism right now. And for better and for worse, this is right now the only place where we still talk. And so I think that support towards multilateralism and what we can do when we work together to save lives, and how important that is, because that is the impartiality piece. And that's the strength, that's the backbone of being able to help civil populations, is that impartiality. And we really do need the world to stand behind this amazing body they established themselves. This is not a group of people who just sat down and said, let's make something great. It's actually government leaders who survived the horrors of the Second World War, who thought we need to find a mechanism where we can continue to talk. And we, to this day, we still talk in the UN. And so I think support, in addition to partnerships, getting behind each other, that piece about humanity, really get behind multilateralism. Because without it, I don't want to think about what the world would look like without it. Respect for human rights. We have so little to be proud of in this world, but humanity can really be proud of the two main covenants and the Charter of Human Rights. That's aspirational, and we should always strive for that. And that's our legacy.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Sophia, and thank you, Ulla, for participating. So I also want to invite Sally up for the ending. If any of you have a question, just raise your hand, and we will hand you a microphone. If there's any questions.
Or did we speak universal truth? That's the question.
Yes. It should be working.
Hello. My name is Jose. I come from the Foundation of Human Rights. First of all, thank you for this wonderful panels. Really interesting and really eye-opening to see how the world is looking right now and what needs to be done. So with that, I have a question about, Ulla, what you said about democracy and what you're seeing with how people are not using their voices and what's happening. We have seen a shrink in civil society. The government is decreasing the funding to civil society. We also have a more polarized society where people that use their voice against war and against violence against children and women, they are being labeled as extremists. And that is a process that's been going on for many countries along Europe right now. And I would like to know if you have an analysis of what can happen, what can we do to overcome these obstacles in this kind of democratic backsliding process that we're in right now, when civil society is being restricted the way it is.
I think we could probably have a seminar on that, couldn't we?
Yeah.
So I will still claim that the Nordic model for democracy works quite well. But I think Olivier de Schutter, he's the special rapporteur on extreme poverty. And he did his report to the Human Rights Council back in May. And one of his conclusions is that this stringent focus on economic growth, I'll loop it around in the end, so don't worry, but that focus on economic growth, it's all about profit, has actually somehow diminished democracy because the focus is on growth for the sake of growth. And that also means that power and everything that is produced in this world is produced to satisfy the demand of the richest. And in that process, we lose sight of the social development. And if we are not deliberate about how we reallocate those resources in our quest for social growth, economic growth, then we just increase poverty gaps. We end up with the climate crisis we have, and we also end up in a more divided world. So I think I don't have a full comprehensive answer to you just on my feet, but I think part of that is also, as human beings, beginning to think differently about what is it we value. Because when we value and look at our own prosperity first, the SDGs is peace, people, prosperity, and I always forget the last one, planet, right? And if we look at that, that's for all of us. It's not for individuals. And I think maybe that is a mindset we need to get more into, because that is a mindset that has shifted. The societies and democracies that we have in this part of the world is built on a fundamental principle that we look out for each other. And when we lose sight of that, I think that's when we come into these mechanisms that are just not healthy. And I think that's also the shooter's point is, if we focus on that, the division becomes bigger and you close down the dialogue. And when you close the dialogue, you end up where you have. So I think it's about opening the dialogue. But just remember, it has to be peaceful. And I think that is, the right to demonstrate, all of those things is fundamental. But they have to be peaceful and do not encourage more violence. And I recently read from someone much wiser than me that said, shedding the blood of others will not make the blood of the ones you lost run in their veins again. And it's a long, quick way, but it basically means all these things about revenge and everything is not going to bring back the ones you loved. But we have a choice. So, but I would say use your right. It's a democracy. Use your voice, but use them peacefully. Even if it means you have to go back many times. You can learn from women on that, because we've been going back many, many times. And we are still not there. And we are still being silenced. But we will still come back. But do it peacefully and diligently.
Thank you. I think we could do one last question and then we need to conclude the seminar. So is there anyone having a question? Yeah?
Thank you so much. My name is Gabriela. I'm from We Empower Her, which is a women-led organization in Uganda in a refugee settlement. So my question is how do you support women or parents of those teenagers girls? Do you provide some funds or finding or skills development for them so that they can support their teenagers to encourage them to stay at school, because some parents still choosing between putting food on the table of their children or providing them with menstrual products, as you're saying. How do you support those parents with skills that they can do, or to get self-reliant so that they can support also their children or teenagers to stay at school to avoid these child marriages? Because some girls still choose and get sexual abused because they do the exchange between the menstrual product in exchange of sex or some money that they can get to buy this menstrual product. How do you support them? Thank you.
I think our approach is very similar, so I'm going to let Jean speak to that, because I think it is a pretty recognized model we are working on. So do you want to...
Probably more apt with your programs to speak to it, but I can speak to some of the evidence. I'll take it after. Okay, I can speak to the evidence, but I think Ulla can better speak to the actual programs on the ground. I think economic strengthening is a huge part of the puzzle, and that comes out very clear in the evidence. And also when there was a review of all the different types of girl-centered interventions across humanitarian contexts, the one piece that came out that was really missing is the economic strengthening. That's talking about the girl. Then taking that a step further, I think the other shift that we've seen in girl-centered programs is also to include caregivers, right? So also have sessions for caregivers, and also have those ensure that those sessions are tailored to meet the needs. So whether it's economic strengthening, for example, skill building, etc. So I think what you're saying there is very much reflected in the evidence, and we're seeing in terms of how people design their interventions, they're designing now with the whole family, whole community approach. So that means it's not just focusing on the girl as the individual. We know the girl's connected with, relationships, family, intimate relationships as well. So it's looking at it in a more holistic way, and trying to work on the different levels. And find out what's needed and then design to respond to that. And I think this also speaks to the structural piece as well that I mentioned. So ensuring that as well there are alternatives for girls, and also those girls who've been married, and also women, to move into, to build up their skills, and to eventually, for example, move into employment opportunities further down the line, for example. That piece is really important in terms of the alternatives to child marriage, the alternatives to, being forced to sell your body for food or other products. So it's that structural piece as well, right? There needs to be opportunities for girls and women to move into, until that's there as well, which it's going to be going in a bit of a circular approach. And I'm sure you have more to add on that.
I mean, we work in the same way, as you said, with the entire community, and we work very much also with parents and also with brothers, right? Because it is about an entire family approach to this. And there are, to the extent we can, and here's again issues around resources available and what are the mechanisms we set in place, we are trying to also encourage parents and help them to make sure, predominantly on the food side, because that's normally where they struggle the most, is that if the daughter is there, she needs to eat, right? So there's something around meals provision and school programs, school feeding programs that WOP is doing. So we work across agencies to make sure that we think through that if we do want the girl to go to school and not marry her off, then she needs to eat, and the parents can't afford it. That's a part of why they get married, right? So we're trying to think through all of those things. And of course, if we can, we would work with some other agency or civil society organizations. So one of the things, for instance, we do for our dignity kits, where we have reusable menstrual pads. And very often we work with local NGOs, and then they will use the people in the community to make them, and then that becomes an income. So we are trying to all the time think through how do we connect those dots so that it also becomes gainful employment in the communities we work in. So many different ways of working, and it's not easy because cultures are also different. I mean, your own country is even though it's part of the East African community, you cannot compare Tanzania and Uganda on this particular issue because it's different drivers, right? So we're really trying to be mindful, but yes, we are always looking for somehow to ensure that we have gainful employment. That is also one of the SDGs. It's decent work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your engaging and very educational responses to the questions. And I want to say a thank you to everyone who has been here today listening to this seminar, and a special thank you for the panelists and the speakers for today. And I want to extend a heartfelt thank you. Your contributions today has highlighted the urgent need to protect girls' rights in times of conflict, from the rise in child marriage to the violation of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So thank you, everyone. A big round of applause.